Welcome to our 115th online gathering for congregational leaders across the country. This weekly gathering is called Courageous Leadership and is sponsored by ELCA's coaching ministry. I am Jason O'Neill, one of your support staff for the ministry and one of your facilitators today. And thank you to David Hively for shifting his calendar around to support us today. Jill and her husband Dave both tested positive for COVID this week. And are experiencing rough symptoms and have asked for your prayers. And she said this is a great time to remind us that COVID is not over and to please continue wearing masks, especially in solidarity with those who are disabled and or immunocompromised. So back to the space today. We aim to create and hold a safe and brave space in these weekly gatherings for you to bring the truth of who you are and how you are doing. These conversations are meant to be an intentional step to live more fully into God's dream for us as the body of Christ. We are grateful you are here, including those of you watching this recording. Thank you for joining us in this experimental way of practicing how to be in community. Today, we are excited to have the Reverend Dr. Becca Ehrlich, did I say that correctly? I've never checked with you, with us. She is author of Christian Minimalism, Simple Steps for Abundant Living, and blogs at christianminimalism.com. For those of you able to join us in person today, you are in for an extra treat because our wheel of names, or as Jill calls it, the magic wheel, is here once again, and we will be giving away 3 of Becca's books throughout our time. The lens Becca brings to being a minimalist, focused on Jesus, helps us to understand that it is not about living a barren, stark life, but about being freed from unnecessary and unhelpful things to live more fully into the abundant life we are called to in God. So Becca, thank you for being with us today. Welcome to our space.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be with you all. We'll actually start with some brief devotions. And what we're going to do is we're going to do something called dwelling in the word, which is very similar to the spiritual practice of Lectio Divina, if you've done that before. But the difference being there's specific questions that go with each round. So you read the text 3 times throughout the time, and then each time there's a different question or questions to think about as you contemplate the text. So I'm going to put the text in the chat. And it's Luke 12, 13 through 21. And so I'll read the text the first time. Can I have 2 volunteers to read it the second or third round? Or I can just call on someone when we get there, which is also a possibility. Maybe I'll just do that. Okay. And then what we'll do is we'll read the text and then I'll pose the questions, and you're welcome to either contemplate on chat silently or aloud, up to you. All right, reading from Luke 12. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who sent me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And Jesus said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." And then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God." What words or phrases stand out to you? What do you notice?
You fool.
Tammy, would you mind reading it second time for us?
Sure.
Thank you.
The parable of the rich fool. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be judge and arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of the rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God."
What do you wonder about? What would you ask a biblical scholar or the author or God about this text? I wonder how the rich fool reacted when God said to him what God said.
I wonder, when can I relax?
Great question, David. Jason, would you mind reading it a third time for us?
Sure thing. Just scroll. Okay. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God."
What does the text say to you today? How does it inform your discipleship?
Be discerning about what to let go of.
All right, shall we close our devotions with a prayer? Loving God, we thank you for this reminder that being rich toward God is what we're to strive for and not an abundance of possessions. Guide our conversation today and help us to think about how we can live in ways that you are calling us to live. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, let me share my screen. There we go. Good. Okay. Everyone good? You can see? Great. Fantastic. So some of us were here a little early and we got the question, but in case you didn't, the question, what do you think of when you hear the word minimalism? Feel free to unmute yourself and say it, or type something in the chat if you haven't already.
Maybe I'll read those that we're good and that we're putting.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, decluttering, just the essentials, quality over quantity. Mm-hmm. Those were the things that were mentioned earlier.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else when you hear the word minimalism? Okay, well, this is what most people picture when they hear the word minimalism. It's a room devoid of color with one chair that's usually black or white, and there's nothing else in the room. And it's boring, and it's colorless, and it's joyless, and it's Spartan and awful, right? I'm here to tell you that that is not what minimalism is. This is the definition of minimalism that I use. It's a focus on the aspects of life that matter most and intentionally removing everything else, right? So the focus is specifically on what's most important, and then you take steps to remove those things that are keeping you from focusing on what's most important. Make sense? Any questions or comments about the definition? Is it a surprising definition for anybody? Okay.
So I mean, what first comes to mind is an art form, but I don't exactly if that's the picture that you showed, and I'm not exactly clear even on what it means in art. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. So historically, there was a design style called minimalism that was used. And so it wouldn't really look like that necessarily, but it was definitely a stripped down kind of style. And so a lot of times when we're talking about minimalism, the lifestyle, people call to mind minimalism, the design style, which are two very different things. So thanks for bringing that up, because I think that that's partially some of what people are thinking of when they think of minimalism. Good. So the next question, the next logical question, right, when you're talking about a focus on the aspects of life that matter most is, what are the aspects of life that matter most? I'm so glad you asked that question. And there's two guys that are really good about branding minimalism. And so if you've heard about minimalism before you came today, chances are you've probably heard something they did, even if you didn't know it was from them. They call themselves the Minimalists. They're Ryan Nicodemus and Joshua Fields Milburn. And they're two guys who realized that they did not like the life they were living. They were climbing the corporate ladder. They were putting money and worldly success over happiness and joy, and actually focusing on the things that matter most. And both decided to get out of that. And now their life's mission is to tell people about minimalism. And they have a list of the aspects of life that matter most. This is their list: health, relationships, passion, growth, and contribution. Any surprises or questions about those? Is there anything on there that surprises you that you didn't think would be there? No? Everyone's like, yep, that looks right.
I'm glad to see contribution on the list, because often, at least my association with this is that it can tend to be a fairly individualistic approach to living. And so seeing contribution in there sort of pushes back against that, which is good to see.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. It's interesting because historically, when people have tried to live more simply, it's been typically separatist movements, which means they've like separated themselves from society in order to live more simply. Like think like monasteries or the Amish, or those are just some examples. Whereas minimalism is very much living at more simply in our current culture, right? Like we're not ever telling everybody to go like live on a commune in a forest and live more simply. I mean, if you're called to do that, like have at it, but that is not what I do. I don't live off the grid, obviously, in the middle of nowhere, like just like living off the land. That is not my thing. So it's very much it's trying to do it within community and within society versus like doing it by yourself, if that makes sense. So thanks for pointing that out. Anything else about this list?
So it seems to me that even, and I don't want to get off on a whole rabbit track, but it seems to me that what matters most would matter differently to different people. So I even think about the Enneagram. I mean, I'm a 9, so what matters to me is living a life conflict-free. I'm married to a 6 who values security. And so I'm just wondering if there's room in that definition for, personality, for personal preferences, or if this is by definition what is supposed to matter.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say yes. This list is basically a starting point. I think the minimalist would probably say this is a standard list. I don't agree. I think this is a starting point, and then obviously everyone has things that they would add to the list. Or another thing to point out is that we focus more on aspects in different parts of our life, right? So if we're going through a health crisis, for example, our health would be most important in that time frame, while the others are just as important, but like take a back seat for that season of our lives. So you're right. Sometimes there's added things, and sometimes there's focus on one of them more than the others, or 2 of them more than the others, depending on where you are in life. Yeah. So it's definitely a movable thing, right? Like it's not going to be the same all the time. With that said, I would say that the starting point list is probably pretty accurate for most cultures. Like if you ask people what is most important, most people would list these types of things. Great question. So the next logical question, right? So if we're focusing on the aspects of life that matter most and intentionally removing everything else, what usually gets in the way of us focusing on what's most important? And this is not an exhaustive list, just some things to get us started, but material possessions and upkeep, money spending habits, time and energy spending habits. We don't usually think about those as much as we think about money spending habits, but our time and energy are not infinite, although sometimes we like to think they are. But we have to be intentional about how we use our time and energy as well. Taking on too much, church people never do that, right? Never, never, never. Yeah. And anybody else, can you think of anything else that gets in the way of focusing on what's most important? I think John's trying to unmute. There we go.
I'm sorry, I'm working with my phone today and I'm not used to doing that. So
that's okay.
I wonder if can some of the things that get in the way be some of the things on the list? I mean, if we're in a health crisis, that's going to absorb a lot of our, if not all of our energy, to the extent that we have no time, no money, none of the things that would make for a satisfactory life.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It's the flip side of the coin, right? Like the things that matter most, if things are happening in our lives, they could also be an obstacle. It just depends on what's happening at that point in time. Yeah, that's a great point.
How is career or employment not on that list?
Well, the minimalists would argue that that would be passion. I'm going to argue it's something else in a minute. So hold that thought. But that's where they would put that, is like, what are you passionate about in life? It could be what you get paid for. It could be something else outside of your career, but and it could be contribution depending on what your job is as well. But yeah, that's where they would put it. Where was I?
Excuse me, Becca. Alex, did you want to say something there? Oh, okay. Trying to watch the unmutes.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. I appreciate it. So here's basically the concept of minimalism and why we think it's helpful in life. So it aims to cut through the clutter to focus on what really matters. So what you're doing is you're identifying what's most important, intentionally removing everything else that's keeping you from focusing on those things. And then however you want to talk about it, minimalism, minimizing, decluttering, getting rid of stuff and commitments. We'll talk more about the difference between decluttering and minimalism. But the idea of getting rid of those things that are keeping you, right, those obstacles. Plus, the other side of it is intentional consumption of goods, time, energy, and money, right? Like getting rid of those things that keep you from focusing on what matters most isn't going to matter much if you're also not on the other side of it, living more intentionally and consuming and buying and spending your energy and time more intentionally as well. And so all of that is the goal of freedom of more time, energy, and financial resources to focus on what matters most. That is the goal. I think that's a worthy goal, obviously, since I write about this a lot and talk about it a lot. But I think too often we end up filling our schedules and our time and our energy and our resources on things that really don't matter for various reasons. You know, we can talk about why that happens. I think a lot of it is what we think expectations are, or what we feel obligated to, as opposed to what we actually feel called to. And then finding ways to cut through all of that and really focus on what's most important and be more intentional in how we're living. Any questions or comments on any of that? Okay, this is my disclaimer moment. There's no right way to be a minimalist. I think people here living as a minimalist, and we expect someone just owning things that fit in a suitcase and that's all they own in the world. And there's some people that do that. I don't do that. You know, there's also on the other end of the spectrum, people who own a house and own 2 cars and just try to live more simply in a way that makes sense for their family, and everything in between. And so it's really prescriptive rather than restrictive. It's a lifestyle that can be adjusted for your personal context and current life situation. So someone living by themselves might live as a minimalist differently than someone who is married and has children. And that's to be expected. I mean, that's just going to look very different, and that's okay. Now is also a good time to talk about the difference between decluttering and minimalism. Decluttering has been a very trendy thing where the goal is to get rid of stuff, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there's no follow-up around it, like why you accumulated the stuff in the first place, and also like it's all about the stuff. Whereas minimalism, I think we've established, is a full-on lifestyle and worldview, right? It's about focusing on what's most important, getting rid of everything else. And so decluttering things might be part of minimalism, but it's not the only thing, because you're also on the flip side trying to live more intentionally and confront the reasons why you might have accumulated you know, like social media usage that's not helpful and like frittering away time, or things in your schedule that aren't helpful, or things if your issue is things as well. So it's a much broader thing than decluttering is. Good? Okay, great. So now we're connecting Christian or minimalism to Christianity. So I wanted to connect it, right? I discovered minimalism and I was like, why is no one doing this? It was the end of 2017. I discovered the Minimalists. I watched their original documentary on Netflix, and they kept talking about meaning. And I was like, well, okay, so meaning for Christians is Jesus. And this sounds a whole lot like what Jesus talked about. So obviously there's a connection here. And I really want to talk in depth about like what this means as a Christian and as a follower of Jesus, living more simply. And quite frankly, there wasn't a lot about minimalism itself. Obviously, the idea of simplicity through Christianity over time has been a theme. And so like, obviously the Desert Fathers and Mothers talked about living more simply and that kind of stuff. And there was a simplicity movement in the 70s and 80s. But the new rendition of minimalism and Christianity was not really there. So I decided to start writing about it, which is yay. And that's why we're here today. And the theme verse that I really love for Christian minimalism, and it sounds like a paradox, but I love it. Jesus says in John 10:10, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. And I think it really makes us think about like, what does an abundant life look like in Jesus, right? Is it the same thing as what consumer culture says abundant life looks like? I would argue no. It is most definitely much more full in the sense of following Jesus, having that connection with God, and then also loving God and serving others, which I would argue that consumer culture really doesn't value at all, in fact. And then as we read in Luke 12:15, Jesus is very clear that our goal in life is not to accumulate possessions, which consumer culture tells us is the goal. Questions or comments on that? All right, and so I promised, here it is. This is the list that I use both on my blog and in the book about what matters most in Christian minimalism. Fellowship, self-care, stewardship, spiritual growth, vocation, and service. So you were asking about vocation, I deliver. And as you can see, it has similar themes to what the list that the minimalists have, but I think it's a little broader in the sense of talking about spirituality and relationship with God and faith, but also a broader sense of like what our purpose in life is, what does it mean to use resources wisely in the name of God, stewardship, and all of that, and service, right? Any questions or comments on that list? Any surprises? Okay. So as we read, we got just a taste of what Jesus says in multiple places with our devotion today. But Jesus is clear, the goal of life is not material wealth, fame, or human accomplishments. And he constantly speaks against deriving meaning in life from those things. And so here's just another quick example. So who's the greatest, right? The disciples are arguing about who the greatest is, as you do. We may not like physically argue about who the greatest is, but we like to one up each other sometimes. And Jesus says, you know, the goal is to be the last of all and servant of all. He also says the last shall be first, and that Jesus, the Son of Man, was called not to be served, but to serve. And as followers of Jesus, that's a goal for us too. And just to throw it out there, Jesus talked a lot about money and material possessions. So like it matters to God. So 16 of the 38 parables Jesus told are about money and possessions. In the Gospels, 1 out of every 10 verses has to do with money. And in the whole Bible, more than 2,000 verses are about money or possessions. So this is a big deal. This is something that God is calling us to think about a little more than what we might be doing now. Real quick, I believe Jesus is a minimalist, and here's why. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and prophets. So at Jesus's time, there were over 600 laws that people were expected to follow, and Jesus literally boiled it down to 2, which is pretty minimalist, if you ask me. And also one of my other favorite quotes from Jesus is, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And I think this really could be considered a mission statement for Christian minimalism, if you will, because quite frankly, what we treasure, what we think is most important, that's where our heart will be. And Christian minimalism invites us to rethink that in light of living in a consumer society. I'm going to tell you the meaning of life today. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. So as Christians, we're called to be countercultural and strive to be minimalist in a consumer society because we know, right, we established that our life's meaning is not wrapped up in material things or wealth or fame or fortune or human accomplishments or accolades. It's through Jesus and what he did for us on the cross and his resurrection that our lives have meaning. And we have one life, as the kids like to say, YOLO, you only live once. So a question that we can ask ourselves regularly is, how can we focus on what matters most to love and serve God and others? And how can God help us do that? Quick quote from Henry Nouwen, which I love. Spiritual identity means we are not what we do or what people say about us, and we are not what we have. We are beloved daughters and sons of God. That is our core identity. It's really easy to lose sight of that when you live in a consumer society, but that is who we are, and that is where we derive our meaning and identity. All right. So, any questions or other things about Christian minimalism you want to discuss? This was like a really quick whirlwind tour through Christian minimalism. I usually talk at least an hour. So if there's more you want to talk about and or you want to check more out, Jason mentioned at the beginning, but obviously the book and then also the blog. And on the blog, there's a contact. So you can contact me through the blog if you wake up at 3 a.m. and you're like, oh my gosh, I wonder about this thing about like living more simply. You can email me and we can chat, which would be good.
And Becca, we'll also put this with the recording, which I'll have up by tonight.
Great.
So we'll have your contact information for people. That way we can just copy and paste it.
Fantastic. Thank you. So good question, Jason. Are we breaking out into groups or are we doing it as one group today for discussion?
So we are smaller today. Do we want to put it to the group? We can pause the recording because I know folks sometimes don't want their real conversations recorded. Or if you're open to being recorded, then we can have that available for the people who watch the recording.
Yeah, it's up to folks. We have discussion questions, so we can either break out into smaller groups. We have enough to break out in groups, so if people want to do that, we can. Or we can stay in a large group, whatever people want.
Does anyone have a preference?
Y'all are going to make me make the decision, aren't you? All right, why don't we go into small groups and then we'll come back in a little bit and discuss what we discussed. Sound good?
Good. Yeah, we'll do about, what is that, 15 minutes?
Yeah.
We'll get back about 10 till. I'll also put these questions in I'll blast them into the breakout rooms for you. All right, welcome back. Before we share together, let's have our drawings for Becca's book. So David, could you please facilitate those for us?
I can. Want to make sure that I've got everybody. I think I have everybody. Oops, you're seeing my wrong screen. My apologies. All right, let's spin and see who gets book number 1. Here we go. Pastor David, congratulations. You get number 1.
2 weeks in a row, isn't it, David? Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
It pays to show up.
Yeah.
Lucky winner number 2 will be Wendy.
All right. Congratulations, Wendy.
And number 3, here we go.
Oh, Leonard had to log off. We can get it to Leonard. We'll let Leonard win even if he's not here.
You can win in absentia.
Yes. I know because he was here to start and then had to log off during the middle of breakout rooms.
Okay.
Awesome. Congratulations, y'all. So keeping the confidence of your small group colleagues, what are some learnings that surfaced?
We talked about the need for minimalism to also be community minded
Mhm.
and what's best for the community. And then a phrase used was major in the majors. I really like, major with majors. Yeah, in the majors.
That's so great. When we have some more time than what we had today, usually we end up talking about what does minimalism look like at a congregational level or at a ministry site level. Because one of the things I love thinking about is like, if you look at an organization's budget, for example, it says what they prioritize, right? What they're intentionally spending their resources on. And that's just one way to think about minimalism at an organizational level and not just a personal level. So thanks for bringing that up. Leonard gets a book. Anything else anyone's taken with them today about Christian minimalism?
In our group, we noted that for some of us, minimalism was not a new thing. We grew up with it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a choice.
Yeah. That's also
this particular take on minimalism feels like it's being offered as a choice, but not everyone who is minimalist is doing that because it's a choice.
Right.
And I think we should be careful that in our positions of privilege to recognize that.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. It depends on where people are, in life and what their situation is. And some people have to do aspects of this regardless, and they don't get to choose it. What's interesting is that regardless of socioeconomic status, one of the things that minimalism really focuses on is intentional living. And so I think everyone can do that in some aspect, whether it be like if you don't own that much stuff because you don't have the resources to do that, obviously that's not going to resonate, but finding ways to live in a way that you're doing it deliberately as opposed to living on automatic pilot or what people expect of you or whatever. I think that's one piece that can be used across the board.
I think of the word meaningful in this context, like what's meaningful to you. So then almost the resources are secondary.
Mm-hmm.
Or could be.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I will say that often we talk about minimalism in, people who are middle to upper class, because that's mostly people who have to think about it. But a lot of times it does come up with other folks, just the intentional living and finding ways to find meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe one more sharing from the small groups.
Well, thinking even back to the devotion that you did, Becca, what comes to mind too when that passage comes up is George Carlin's. George Carlin had a routine about our stuff and, the continual need to build bigger and, we have,
I forgot about that. That's funny.
Maybe I'll link to that with the recording too.
Oh, please. That would be great. I totally forgot that he did that, but you're right.
A great reference. Thank you, Wendy.
Yeah.
Well, I want to honor our time. Thank you again for being with us today. All of you, Becca, yes, thank you for sharing with us. We hope you'll join us next Wednesday as we once again host our small groups by topic. And as you move on with your day and week, a blessing. You are seen, you are valued, you are loved.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.